Pauline is a behavioral scientist at Irrational Labs. Her work focuses on applying behavioral insights for public health, including building a Medicaid-approved kidney dialysis program in the United States, increasing medical adherence for Parkinson's disease, and increasing COVID-19 vaccine uptake in Kenya, Syria, and North Africa. Prior to joining IL, Pauline launched the health practice at BE Works, which is a Canadian similar consultancy to us. Dan also co-founded that and was a featured speaker at the Mayo Clinic's Transform 2019 conference. She earned her BS in psychology from Queen's University outside Toronto and her MS in global cum laude from McMaster University, also in Canada. It is true, she is Canadian. We like Canadians. Canadians are an integral part of our organization, and we celebrate their Canadianness every day. And you should know that this is not very Canadian. You would say she's like, in her downtime, Pauline enjoys scuba diving. Not very Canadian, but very cool, and ballet dancing. So with that, I'm going to pass the mic over to Pauline, who is going to melt your brains with how you build a BeSci unit internally. So thank you for coming, Pauline. And thank you everybody else for joining us.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Ryan. Always fun to get Ryan to do the introductions. One thing, I'll clear the air. I'm not sure if you heard ballet dancing or belly dancing. So it's ballet. Let me assure you, I'm not a very good belly dancer at all.
I swear I said ballet. Did it sound like belly? Do I have a terrible Midwestern accent? I'm so sorry.
It might be my Canadianness.
It could be. It could be. Either way, yeah, to be clear, not belly.
Awesome. So I won't go too much into my background because Ryan did a great job of that. I'd like to just really start us off and dive into things by asking this question. So in 2020, how many behavioral insights teams do you think there were globally? I'll give you some time. Maybe you can type it in the chat what you think your answer would be. And as you're casting your vote, I'll give you a little hint, or I'll anchor you a little bit. So you might recall that in 2010, just over a decade ago, the first behavioral insights team was founded in the UK Cabinet Office. So I don't know if that helps or hurts some people, but let's see what people think. Ooh, we have some folks who are quite familiar with maybe this research. So if you responded D, 597, congratulations, you are correct. In 2020, so this number is probably even lower than it is today, but there was a global survey that was conducted by Stephen Wendell and colleagues of behavioral science teams, and they cataloged through that research 597 teams globally that were practicing behavioral science. And this number has risen rapidly over the years. So in 2018, there were just 202 behavioral science units that were recorded. And as you can see, between 2018 to 2020, we went from 202 to almost 600. So there's been a huge rise in behavioral science capacity, interest in behavioral science within organizations. And we're not only seeing it in the United States, in the United Kingdom, or in Canada, but we're really seeing it globally. So there's been teams that have cropped up in the Philippines, in Peru, in Vietnam, in Lebanon, in Jordan, places that you might not expect behavioral science to be. And there's also a lot of organizations globally that are applying behavioral science. So you can see here, there are international humanitarian organizations like the World Bank that now have behavioral science capacity in-house. There's health companies like Humana and Clover that have behavioral science capacity, financial service companies, the Googles of the world, tech companies, CPGs. There's a wide range of organizations that have really embedded behavioral science into their everyday work and practice. And with all of these companies, building in BI capacity, you might be wondering whether this investment is really worthwhile. Is the juice worth the squeeze? Is this another fad? Are people going to be regretting these investments down the line? Or is this really an investment that's worthwhile for organizations as they continue to grow and build? So this was a question that a few researchers were quite interested in studying empirically. And in 2017, the researchers Shlomo Benartzi, Katie Milkman, and John Bashirs and their colleagues conducted some research to answer exactly this. Is a return on investment really worth it for organizations to invest in building a behavioral science unit? So they conducted a study where they calculated the ratio of the impact to cost for nudge interventions and how that compared for traditional policy tools like tax incentives and penalties. And perhaps unsurprisingly to many of you on the call who are interested in behavioral science, they found that nudges were less expensive and had a greater impact on behavior change than traditional policy tools. So the best way to really illustrate this is with an example. So this is a case study that was pulled from the behavioral science team at the White House. They were known as the Social and Behavioral Science Team, SBST. I say were because they are no longer in office at the White House. They were dissolved once the Trump administration came in, but they did some really interesting work while under the Obama administration. And one of the projects they did was in collaboration with the US Department of Defense. So they wanted to determine, how can we increase savings among military personnel in defined contribution retirement plans? So these personnel were given contribution retirement plans, and the original state of affairs was that the federal government would match their contributions. So they were really trying to incentivize, use a very traditional policy tool to get military personnel to contribute to their retirement plans. And these researchers wanted to determine, is there a different way? Can we get people to contribute to their retirement plans without necessarily financially incentivizing them? So the researchers conducted an experiment in which about 800,000 military personnel who were not already investing in a defined contribution plan were placed into one of three groups. The first group was the control condition. This was business as usual, what the government had always been doing, which was matching and incentivizing people to contribute to those defined contribution plans. The second two groups were the treatment groups that the behavioral scientists had developed. So both of them were emails basically telling people that they could contribute and framing those contributions in different ways. So the first email in group B framed those contributions as investing in your future, investing in your future self, what do you want to do with your family and your kids and your life down the line? Invest in that today by investing and contributing to your financial savings plan. The second email had a slightly different framing. It had something along the lines of, our records indicate that you're not enrolled, here's how you sign up, make sure you make use of this program that you're entitled to. What the researchers found was that in absolute terms, there weren't really significant differences between the three groups. So the control group, which received the traditional policy, saw a 1.1% savings plan enrollment rate over the month that this experiment was conducted. Group B and Group C, who received the emails, saw slightly higher number of people who ended up contributing. They saw a 1.6% contribution rate, and the other group saw 2.1%. So 2.1% of that population had started to contribute to that plan. If you look at the absolute terms, you're probably thinking, man, this didn't really have a huge impact. Maybe behavioral science, behavioral insights, juice isn't quite worth the squeeze. And that's true at first blush, that does seem like it. But when we consider the overall project, the deployment of the email campaign was just $5,000 relative to the deployment of a financial incentive. So instead of matching contributions, the government was giving just $5,000 to an email campaign. And just in 1 month, they were able to see $1.3 million that had been invested and saved by military personnel. So this case study demonstrates that nudge policies don't need to always produce a really large impact in absolute terms to be effective. Sometimes we need to think more broadly about, well, what's the cost relative to the impact here? And in this case, the cost of a $5,000 email campaign is significantly better at increasing contributions relative to a matched incentive program. And the efficacy of nudging really extends beyond this cost for nudge ratio. So there's also been a lot of really established behavioral insights units around the world who have come out and said that they are seeing impressive rates of return on their investment. So the UK Behavioral Insights team, which I mentioned earlier, was sort of the first behavioral insights team to be formed in the UK cabinet, and now they've moved sort of independently to consult on their own. But in the first 2 years of operation, they reported a 10-fold return on their costs for the government in its first 2 years. So that's really quite significant. And the team Beta, which is in Australia, behavioral economics team of the Australian government, reported $10 returned to the government for every dollar invested in the team. So there are some pretty significant returns on investment for some organizations as well as governments for investing in behavioral science capacity. And as a result of all of this promise, all of these results, many practitioners are starting to claim that it's actually not a matter of if someone will build BI into their organization or behavioral science capacity into that organization, but rather it's a matter of when. At what time will it occur? And this is a really interesting sort of reframing of behavioral science, where it was traditionally seen as a more innovative practice that only certain companies would adopt. Now it seems like a lot of practitioners around the world really think that it'll be adopted synonymously across the board. So if I was able to successfully convince to you that this is a good idea, then you're probably asking, how do you go about actually doing something like this? How do people go about building a unit? And the steps that we're going to go through in a moment are steps that we identified through some work I did with the Gavi Vaccine Alliance under an organization called Common Thread. So the Alliance wanted us to basically advise on whether they should invest in behavioral insight capacity to increase immunization globally. So this project was funded at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. There was a lot of concern around when vaccines come out, will people actually uptake those vaccines, and how might we think about using behavioral insights and behavioral science to better understand people's hesitations toward vaccination and encourage them to get vaccinated. So we took up a literature review to basically figure out, is this a good idea, first of all? And if it is, what should people like Gavi or other organizations be doing in order to build this type of capacity in their organization? And the first thing we really did is we looked at those 600 units that existed around the world, and we found the ones that were most similar to Gavi. And then we analyzed patterns across each organization. So are there similarities in the methodologies those teams use, in the size of those teams, in the way that they introduce their team to a broader organization? We also reviewed 13 white papers that detail recommendations on behavioral insights units themselves. And then we conducted over 25 interviews with behavioral science experts. So these were experts who had all successfully created their own teams at different organizations, who had documented their successes, but had not necessarily shared those documents publicly. And what we found were there's basically 7 common steps that came out of this process. And the first step to really building your behavioral insight unit within your own organization is something like looking for a leader. So someone in the organization who has organizational clout to lead the team. Now, this leader that you select to sort of lead the BI team does not need to be someone who is very knowledgeable in behavioral science. It does not need to be a behavioral scientist, but it does need to be someone who has large sway and influence within the organization. Because the main role of this leader is really going to be to champion behavioral science across the organization and advocate for the unit, advocate for resources, advocate for projects and for funding. And the risk of not selecting a BI leader is really, not developing clear momentum and buy-in at the onset. So for the behavioral science team, the SBST team that did that research for the military, one successful tactic that they used early on was they actually had President Obama sign, and Eric Singler, who's a founder of the CEO of BVA Nudge Unit, said this was a major win for that unit at the time. Barack Obama signed an executive order about the Nudge Unit, and this really helped garner excitement about the Nudge Unit in the White House and allowed them to be able to access more opportunities for projects and working with different departments within the government. And one of the most important functions of a leader is really to persuade senior management across the organization. Now, one way that the leader can actually persuade senior management, and one way that's used quite often by other behavioral science units, is free BI trainings to senior officials. And the reason that this is super helpful is because BI to a lot of people, or behavioral science, you'll notice I'm going back and forth between behavioral science and behavioral insights. I use those interchangeably, those terms. But it's basically a black box. So a lot of senior leaders might not know what the power of behavioral science or behavioral insights is, what it can do. And what these free trainings help is they help uncover really what behavioral science is all about and how it can be applied. And so you can really start getting initial buy-in from top level organizational leaders to then continue your work on the project. Another tried and true method to really relieve early skepticism in the building of your BI unit is to target quick wins. So this means, not looking to focus on really large, complex challenges like organizational change challenges, for example, but really focusing on low-hanging fruit where you're able to, run your research or run your experiment within the first few months of being in the organization and being fully fledged, and then showcasing the results of your work. So it's really important that you show your ROI of the team early, even if it's on a smaller project and more low-hanging fruit, and that you're conducting these free BI trainings to help organizations really understand the value and power of behavioral science. And the last thing I'll say about the leader is that it's really important that when they're bringing this new team into the organization, that they're not framing the team as a new toy. And what I mean by that is we often have this idea to use behavioral science and behavioral insights as this innovative tool that's going to solve all of your problems, and everything you've been doing before that has been wrong, or you're not doing it right. That's not, of course, how you want to enter into the organization. To avoid hostility, to avoid problems with collaborations, you really want to be focusing on the emphasis that BI is an additive process to existing efforts, and it's really not oppositional. So you really want to be focusing on removing headaches for teams that are already overburdened, rather than this is a new tool that everyone can use. That's not how you want to frame behavioral science within your organization when you're embedding it. You want to really showcase how it's additive to what's already going on in the organization. So the second step that came out of all the interviews and the research that we conducted was setting clear mandates and objectives with important behavioral challenges. And I don't think this will come as a surprise to many of you. Setting clear objectives is important, whether you're setting a behavioral science unit, whether you're starting a new project. But some key questions that really came out of this process were making sure that behavioral science leaders who were initiating this work knew why they wanted a behavioral insights team. They knew exactly what challenges they wanted it to solve. They knew which parts of the organization might have already been motivated to get involved. And they also had a very specific focus within the first 1 to 3 years. So they weren't going to boil the ocean and focus on everything. They had, 3 specific areas that they were going to look at. And they also elaborated on what was not on the agenda within their first 3 years. So this just really helped set a clear path forward for the team. The third step in determining, how to build a behavioral insights unit is where it should sit. Should you have a unit that sits in-house, meaning it's completely built within the organization? Should it be an external unit, or should it be some sort of mix of the two, or a hybrid? So the in-house team really means that you have a dedicated team of internal technical experts and behavioral scientists. These are often new hires within the organization, and this team focuses solely on the application of behavioral insights in the organization. Now, one of the key benefits of an in-house team is that it has capacity to take on more projects, because you've hired in that team, for the most part, to focus solely on the application of behavioral science and behavioral insights. So an internal team dedicated to applying behavioral science can really quickly develop a dialogue with different parts of the organization, and can also really easily scope out potential opportunities for projects. And they're also way more familiar with the inner workings of an organization. So they are allowed, that enables them to really increase their efficiency and their ability to work and identify projects. But one challenge with internal teams is that they're quite hard to get off the ground. So once they've been created, they can work really efficiently and effectively within the team, but the upfront time and financial investment might not pair well with organizations that are more risk averse and prefer quicker returns on investment. Now, the external team is the second type of model that we saw quite commonly. And this is a model where you basically hire a behavioral insights consulting firm to take on specific projects. So someone like Irrational Labs, for example, might be the hired external consultant, and you would ask Irrational Labs to help work on specific projects and partner with the organization to help on those projects. Now, of course, the benefit is that you get immediate efficiency and expertise. You have sort of a plethora of behavioral science researchers and scientists who can help focus on your particular area of concern or the project that you're looking to work on. But one of the drawbacks is that because it's an external consultancy, sometimes it's more challenging for them to help you navigate the red tape or really to understand the feasibility of certain ideas. And in addition to that, sometimes, if you want a more long-term investment in behavioral science, this may not be a sustainable option because you're really paying on a project by project basis. The third type of team and sort of the recommended type is this hybrid team. So it's a mix of in-house and external, where basically you have an external consultancy like Irrational Labs, for example, who initially helps you build an internal team's proficiency in applying behavioral insights. So they train you in behavioral insights and behavioral science with people who have already been invested and involved in the organization. So you're not really necessarily bringing in new people. And then the hybrid team model is that as those people get more trained within the organization, the external consultancy removes some of their efforts and actually acts more on a high level and really comes in only for more in-depth complex projects. So they act in a more advisory role and they're not involved in the day-to-day once people within the unit are really comfortable with the application of behavioral science. And one potential drawback of this particular model is that you might have more surface level application of behavioral insights. And what I mean by that is behavioral science enthusiasts, for example, who are trained by an external consultancy, they might have capacity to audit and improve communications, for example, but they may not have as much in-depth knowledge as a purely trained behavioral scientist who knows the science of attention or who knows how to rigorously test and measure impact. And so this could result in slightly different nuances in the type of projects and work that your behavioral insights team does and generates. The fourth step is the selection of an operating model. So the operating model basically dictates how the BI team will collaborate within the organization. And organizations have many moving parts, as we all know. There's human resources, there's finance. And so when you're selecting an operating model, it's really important to be aware that this changes over time and it is certainly not set in stone. You can evolve this model. And there are basically three types of models that we saw in the research when we looked at all of the different behavioral science units that are currently operating today. And those models are a centralized model, a diffused model, and a diffuse with central steering model. So in the diffused model, you basically have several individual behavioral insights units that exist within different departments of an organization. So human resources might have a behavioral insights unit, marketing might have a behavioral insights unit, and none of these units actually coordinate on priorities or implementation. So they're very much working in silos and they have different goals. And one huge advantage of this is that these individual units are a lot closer to the ground. So project implementation and scale up can often be a lot easier. But a drawback, of course, is that this diffused operating model might mean that you're overlapping in some of your efforts. So there could be a lot of duplication between what the marketing team is doing and learning and what human resources is doing and learning. There's not a lot of knowledge transfer between all of the different diffused behavioral science teams within the organization. The second model is this diffuse with central steering operating model. And this basically means that you have a central unit that coordinates the work of individual BI units across an organization. So the central unit sits somewhere at like HQ, for example, or closer to the C-suite level of executives, and they sort of give out the projects to the different units across the organization. And this allows for some synchronization. It also allows for an understanding of what's going on within all of the different departments and knowledge transfer and knowledge sharing. But of course, a challenge with this is that you'll need to set clear governance and procedures between the central department and the departmental behavioral science units. So that adds a little bit of administrative burden when you're pursuing this type of operating model. The final operating model that we saw was the centralized model. So this is a team that's housed at the center of an organization at that C-suite level or at HQ, and they have steering application of behavioral insights across the organization. So basically what this means is that they are consulted for projects on behavioral science, but they don't necessarily sit within one particular arm of the business or the organization. They sit at the HQ level, and so they might not have as in-depth knowledge about particular areas of the business that might be valuable if you were to create a diffused or pursue a diffused operating model. Now, luckily, none of these operating models are lifetime commitments. So as you see in this diagram here, there's been movement between operating models over time. So for example, the UK bit changed from a centralized unit where they were centralized with the cabinet in the UK government to a more diffused unit with central steering when they sort of went out on their own. And other teams like Nudge Lebanon and the EU Policy Lab, they actually pursued this incognito sort of approach where for the first 2 years of creating this behavioral science capacity, they kept it really low profile in the organization. And then once they had really built their internal team capacity and started to gain buy-in, that's when they started to really like expand and create their team more formally. The fifth step of building a BI unit, perhaps unsurprisingly, is, finding money for it. So if you've already selected your leader, you've defined the objectives of your unit, you've figured out where your team is going to sit, you've selected your operating model, you then need to raise funding for this because you're going to be hiring in potentially new BI specialties or, even looking for consultancies to help with that. So when we spoke with several behavioral science experts who had built their own successful BI units, we learned that you really don't want to be on the lower end of funding. So there was one particular unit that we spoke to at a humanitarian organization that budgeted for $250,000 a year to get the behavioral science unit running. And the biggest drawback that they said they had when budgeting this amount was that they were really thrifty. So they thought that this would be a good way to get initial buy-in from senior leadership because it wasn't a huge amount of money. But the challenge was that when they went to go look out for talent and they went to go look for a behavioral scientist, they realized that they were quite expensive. And so they weren't able to hire the best staff to actually get the job done. Now, where we see behavioral science units usually starting out is within this $500,000 to $1 million range per year. And this amount of funding really depends on the team location. So again, depending on whether you decide the team is going to be in-house or it's going to be a mix of the two or it's going to be external, as well as your recruitment needs. So how many people are you going to hire in, or are you going to be training new staff or current staff who are already at the organization? That, of course, will change the amount of money you might need and the funding you might need to build this out. But generally speaking, it seemed like there was a really high push for $1 million to $2 million a year because you need to be able to pay the salaries of the researchers. So if you have 3 to 4 senior associates and 5 to 8 researchers, you're already close to, almost $1 million just in staffing costs. And then you also have to pay for the research itself and the recruitment for participants, et cetera. The sixth step in building a behavioral science unit is creating partnerships. And partnerships are a really excellent tool for building credibility and momentum and internal capacity in a very cost-efficient manner. So partnerships are not required, but they are really recommended. And there's sort of two types of partnerships that you can pursue. You can pursue a partnership with a consulting firm. So this is a consulting firm like Irrational Labs, like BE Works, like the UK BIT team. There's tons of them out there. And basically you work with this, this consulting firm for them to help build the capacity of your behavioral insights team in-house. And so there are some examples here. You know, the New York City behavioral design team was actually a combination of Ideas 42 in the New York City mayor's office. Nudge Turkey was the combination of EY's Turkey BI capacity with the Turkish British Embassy. And so there's lots of examples of these partnerships coming into play. And one key thing about partnerships, of course, is really making sure that the firm that you select is not one that is dedicated to solely academic work, and they're not so academically inclined that they take a very long time to complete research projects or have different, KPIs than you might want for your team. So you want to make sure that you're aligned on that. You want to make sure that the firm has a good track record with partnerships. They might have done partnerships with other organizations in the past for BI capacity. And you also want to make sure that they are dedicated, perhaps most importantly, that they're dedicated to building in-house capacity. So the goal, of course, would not be for them to stay forever, but you want to sort of lengthen the relationship as time goes on so that the capacity that they're building for your team in-house becomes strong enough that your team internally can do most of the work and they're not relying on an external consulting firm. The second sort of partnership that you might want to pursue is an academic one. And this is a really good option if you want to conduct one-off behavioral insights projects, and particularly if you want to have the most up-to-date research coming to the table. So if you're really interested in what the most recent research, academic research is, or on investors in volatile markets, perhaps working with an academic institution who focuses solely on researching that is going to be a better route for you to take than focusing on partnering with an applied behavioral science consulting firm, because the capacity is much broader than that and they don't focus their day-to-day on collecting new research in that particular field. So really, depending on what your goals are with the behavioral science unit, you might want to think about different types of partnerships. Partnering with an academic institution is also really helpful to help ensure you're adhering to high scientific standards. So particularly if you want to be doing some in-field testing or some randomized controlled trials, having partnerships with academics can help with instituting that. The last step that I'm going to take you through, and this is sort of the last step that everybody mentioned before they went into launch mode. And if you're interested in what sort of happens during launch mode, there's more details in that white paper that I shared earlier on the sort of methodology that a lot of behavioral science units take and other activities they do in their actual launch. But the final step is really the building of the team. And at a minimum, it looks like when we spoke to all the experts and we looked at those patterns between different consulting firms and BI organizations, there was at least a research assistant, a behavioral scientist, and a knowledge representative. So at a minimum, there were sort of three folks: the knowledge representative, the behavioral scientist, and the research assistants. And these roles all had to have very clear job descriptions. I won't go into these job descriptions, but if you're interested, you can see how the BI or behavioral scientist differs from the research assistant in that paper. And the size and the composition of the team really depends on the location. So depending on in those earlier steps, whether you select an in-house team or external team or a hybrid team, it'll determine, how big your team is going to be. So based on an analysis of at least 21 units, we saw that in the past 5 years, it's usually around 7 people. That's usually the sweet spot for the number of folks that are in a behavioral science unit within an organization. But within the first 6 months of an operationalized behavioral science unit, it was even smaller than that. So most units started with just 2 or 3 people, usually a BI leader and a behavioral scientist. And then, 6 months into it, they started to grow, and then they grew to a maximum of 7 people in total. And one common mistake that often we saw when speaking with leaders was that it was very common for people to want to hire mostly academics and only focus on the behavioral science capacity within the behavioral science unit. what we learned was that there's actually other capacities that can be really valuable to bring into your behavioral science team. And that includes something like a designer, someone who's solely focused on translating a lot of the behavioral science concepts that your behavioral science might put together into something that's visual and much more easily understood. And similarly, a communication specialist or someone who can help also translate your findings into something you can share more publicly and broadly with your organization to increase buy-in. So over time, you might want to consider adding those types of specialties into your behavioral science unit or your behavioral science team. So at this point, you will have gone through those 7 steps. You will have garnered money and support to set up your unit and your organization. And it's now time to launch. It's now time to go off into the field and see what happens. But before you do, one recommendation we would have is to ask yourself this question. And we would ask you to say, imagine that you have invested $600,000 to $1 million and it's turned up no results. You've had your behavioral science unit in your organization for a year, you invested almost $1 million and there have been no results. But you have found a lot of interesting interviews. You have people who've been brought out of their comfort zones. What do you see as the outcome? If your answer or initial gut reaction to this was that this was a complete failure and a waste of money, then you might not be ready quite yet for a behavioral science unit or building a behavioral science team in your organization. But if you saw some learning out of this, if you felt like this was a fail fast moment where you still gained quite a lot, but didn't necessarily achieve what the behavioral science team was set out to do, then you might be ready. And really what this question is trying to bring you to is that not every behavioral insights team or behavioral insights unit is going to be successful at first launch. And so you need to be okay as an organization to take on some of that risk and allow for sort of a license to fail, if you will. Now, with that very positive note, I will say thank you so much for your attention and for your time on this Friday afternoon, and I'll turn it back to Ryan.
Oh my gosh, you're turning it back to me. I was just eating a Triscuit. Timing is everything. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much, Pauline, for your time and your insight. This is really incredible. Some people are probably want to leave the call to start their unit right now since you gave them such a good roadmap. But assuming that's not the case, what questions do people have? You can raise your hand. I'm going to remove the spotlight so I can see hands. Hold on. Or you can type it in the chat and we can definitely call on you. But we absolutely want people to come step up to the mic and ask your questions. All right, I'm looking. I don't see hands. Let me check the chat. Blake said thank you. Thank you, Blake. Oh, Edgar. Oh, I did put that white paper link in there, but I will paste it again. It's from Common Thread. So Pauline, I have a quick question for you as people marinate. Can you speak more to that, this issue of people wanting to have, oh, wait, hold on. Oh, Edgar found it. Oh, it's okay, Edgar. I forgive you. Oh, wait, Matt has a question. Go ahead, Matt. Take the mic.
Yeah, thank you. Earlier, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yeah, you sound great.
Okay. Earlier in the talk, you mentioned an early effort to educate. I thought you mentioned senior leadership or leaders or stakeholders. I'm curious if you can clarify or expand on that a bit. What level of leadership were you talking about having free education sessions, and what was the content like? What do you visualize for that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very good question. So usually that effort takes place at the decision or the person who makes decisions around project sourcing. So for example, if you're a behavioral science team that you just created in your organization and you're looking for projects, like you're not quite sure where there might be opportunities for behavioral insights teams, you might want to consult, the head of marketing or the senior leader at marketing or the senior leader at product to help them understand the capacity that you've just built within the organization and what that actually means. And so usually the behavioral science sort of leader, that person that initially starts the unit, is getting buy-in from like C-suite executives for the team itself. And then that second step is you're kind of getting buy-in from the people that are making the day-to-day decisions, who might say, oh, I have a project for you, Matt, that I think actually our team could use your support with. So those sessions typically involve, they're typically around 3 hours. They typically include a lot of the really fun behavioral science TED Talk examples to get people excited about the work. So it's usually a definition of behavioral science and then some working sessions around, here are the great impacts that behavioral science has shown to have in this particular application. And here's how we think we can support your marketing team. And so it's sort of like the behavioral science unit's pitch within the internal organization to get them bought in enough and convinced enough to help work on a project together.
Yeah, that's very, very helpful, because I am, and I saw someone, I don't want to steal their thunder, maybe they can talk about culture, but it's sort of like I do have the challenge of, how do you understand, how do you build this, get this buy-in from the top down and from the bottom up, or at least it sounds like the middle up is what you're talking about. So that's very helpful.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and Matt, let me just gratuitous add for that. I mean, so we put together these custom workshops for large companies and small ones as well. So we usually do like 3 days times 3 hours. It's like the self-paced course on roids. And yeah, it's all about kind of building some of the buy-in. But what I will say, just like the self-paced course or the cohort, we do have people work on their stuff. So this is a critical piece for buy-in, right? Like, it's not just BeSci in the abstract. Like, we swap out a lot of example slides to like company specific stuff. And then we're like, oh, work on your problem, because obviously, talking in the abstract is not helpful. Saying, hey, look at your landing page at your company. We just did this the other week. It was really funny. We had someone do a teardown of the company's homepage, and people were like, oh my gosh, opportunity. So this is a powerful way to at least get people probing. And as is always the case, right? Outside people are better at starting the probing than internal people, not because there aren't internal people that can't see it, right? This is just culture stuff, culture club stuff, if you will. Go Boy George with me there for a second. Rick, but you have a great follow-up question to this. You want to jump in?
Well, sure. And not so much a question as just a statement. I mean, most organizations, be they government or nonprofit or corporate, have gone through a process of setting up new units, or at least had the idea of new units identified. And the way I always encourage people to start with this kind of stuff is see what learning lessons you can glean from past experiences recently. I think Pauline laid out a really good series of steps, but having worked in a bunch of organizations, those steps occur in very different order, depending on what kind of culture there is. So my suggestion is start first by seeing what learning lessons you can get from other attempts that have either been successful or have failed, and use that to adapt your strategy for building this one.
Yeah, that's a great BeSci point, that context always matters. I did think, Pauline, though it was funny, if you wanted to be really literal, like, well, the solution is to just have Barack Obama sign off on your BeSci unit. Other questions from out in the field? So I will ask a question if no one does, because I know this applies to some people. Pauline, but any deep or shallow thoughts on the application of this framework in the private versus the public sector? Because I know you really, your experience is more in the public sector, but not entirely.
Yeah, I think, I think Rick had a really good point in that the order of the steps is not necessarily going to be linear. And so the order might be very different in a private sector application than in a public sector application. I think the biggest difference I saw in the interviews when we conducted them with public and private was the difference in garnering interest within the organization. So who you're going to first really depended on, how international the organization was and where there were funding or motivated teams to work with. And then, of course, in the funding piece, and so publicly, you saw in that linear funding slide that the public organization was at the lower end of that, which made it very difficult for them to get the right resources in the door to actually start applying behavioral science. So it took a lot longer for them to get up to speed and build the unit relative to a private organization who might have more financial resources to invest early on in the build of that.
Awesome. And that's a perfect segue to Edgar. Edgar, now is your time to shine. Say this, share this.
You crack me up, man.
That's all I'm here to do. I'm not, I'm just here for
crack me up. No, it's a kudos, I think, to Rational Labs. I've been a fan of the work that Aurelia has done in the past few years. And, really what I put in the chat here is, we have a dedicated innovation team, and they've gotten, probably millions of dollars by now in the past 5 years. And, obviously with more money, there's more pressure to produce results. And I just had an idea, and I just went to senior management and said, listen, I'm not asking for a lot of money. Give me some leeway. I got an idea that I want to prove out, and just completed my third pilot a couple of weeks ago, and I had some great results. And so now they're thinking about institutionalizing some things. So thank you, Rational Labs, for those tips and tools.
Edgar, we're very thankful that was good for you, but do you have an NDA? Can you tell us what the experiment was? Can you give us the gist?
This is the adoption of financial education, financial coaching for our members, for our consumers. Yeah. So
very cool.
So it's along the lines of Common Sense Lab, right? That's what you all do, or they do. So it's just basically, how do you encourage people to sign up and attend sessions that's in their best interest? And of course, we know life gets in the way, and often they don't, but we're still tweaking and refining. So
that's great. And Pauline, you were building on that in the chat.
Yeah, I was just saying, that's such a great point, Edgar. If you really want to get buy-in, that was the point with the do the low-hanging fruit first. But I think as you were alluding to, having a little bit of less money, so it's less risky, so then you can really have fun and have a bit more license to be risky and a license to fail, per se. That was something that came out of a lot of the interviews as well, was this premise of you've really got to have strong leadership, or someone who believes in this ability to fail fast in order to allow us to experiment. Because often with experiments, we learn when something works and we can scale up, but we also learn when it doesn't work. And so we've got to be okay with those results that don't match what we were intending for.
Yeah. And, the one thing I'll add to that is that I was working with multiple divisions to see which one would, where it would live best or would have the best results. And I think that every time I tell the senior leaders, so because many did not know how much money I got. And when I tell them the final story, they're thinking in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then when I tell them I did this under 20K, I think their jaw drops, because again, it's about looking and just sticking with it, following the results, and then seeing, look at this, we did this in a short amount of time, less money. And they just can't say no to that. Right. So.
One of the interesting ways that Colin West, some of you have seen him, he's done some of our events. He talks about it as just selling risk mitigation. Like, well, why would you spend $20 million on something that you haven't tested? Why not spend 20K? A very powerful way to get buy-in and build up. But sometimes people are predictably irrational, as you know. They might be excited about their $20 million project. So any other exciting thoughts or comments? Sheila, I just want to say hi in Connecticut. You want to elaborate on your 2 words, framing and anchoring? I think there's a thought there.
No, I was just ricocheting off of your comments.
Oh, it was like your color commentary.
Yes, right. I was just bedazzling the comments. Thank you.
No, you were crushing it. Although, just to be critical, more emojis, please.
Okay, all right. I'm sorry.
Well, if everybody's good, we can call this a wrap for today. So thank you everybody for coming out to play. We do have a talk next Thursday on a very similar topic. Jen Koo is a vice president of a bank in Canada, and she's one of our IL fellows. She's going to be presenting on how to infuse organizations with behavioral science. So it's a related topic. I think it's kind of like, once you built these foundations, now what? So she'll have a tale to tell and should be exciting. Pauline, thank you again. If everybody could give her some love in the chat via emojis or nice words. Thank you all for coming out. We got a heart up there. That's great. Love the hearts. Yeah, thank you all for coming out. We'll see some of you next week. We have an exciting lineup shaping up for July, so stay tuned. Invites will come. Any house cleaning questions for me before I send everybody on their way? Okay, well, have a wonderful weekend, everybody. Enjoy the warm weather if it's warm where you are. And we'll talk to you all soon. Thank you again, Pauline.
Thanks, Ryan. Thank you all.